Washington State today. But in the 1850s, you've got Vancouver, you've got the presence of the British, and you have the presence of the American forces, and San Juan was kind of this like flashpoint for the British and the U.S., who both kind of quietly claimed the island at the time. Now, the moment that kind of served as the catalyst for what becomes this war happens one day when a pig wanders onto the farm of Lyman Cutler. Lyman Cutler is an American. He has a potato farm on San Juan Islands because the soil is really fertile and really useful for growing. And one of the pigs from a member of the Hudson Bay Company has wandered into his property. The Hudson Bay Company was owned by, it was a British company. And so Cutler walks out, sees this pig rooting through his potato farm, and he shoots the pig and he kills it. Right? The British hear about it, and they arrest Lyman Cutler for killing this pig. Well, the American kind of forces here back in Washington, and they send this guy, Captain George Pickett, to deal with the problem. Now, Captain George Pickett, as you can imagine, is part of the military. And like any military sent to deal with a problem, it's not just him, it's him and a small fighting force. They arrive on the island to deal with Lyman Cutler, who's been arrested. And instead of addressing Lyman Cutler, who is currently in jail, Pickett declares that the entire island of San Juan is American property. The British, naturally, who've been living there, who have been working there, who just have property right across the waterway in Vancouver, decide, no, this is not your island, this is our island. And so the British retaliate by sending a naval force to surround the island. And so here on the island of San Juan, this tiny little beautiful island that you still visit today, is a group of U.S. military forces being stared down right off the coast by the British Navy. And if you happen to be a war historian, the British Navy at that time was one of the most preferred, like the way that we view the American war machine today was how the world viewed the British Navy at that time. The British Navy was an incredibly powerful, agile force. And there's literally a standoff, an absurd but very tense standoff for weeks. And why? Because a man killed a pig and made a bacon sandwich, right? It's at the end of the day, all of this goes back to a pig. And eventually, the two nations come to an agreement to end what has historically been called the Pig War of 1859. And what's fascinating is the human capacity to take a pig, what I like to call pre-bacon, and turn it into something that was literally at the level of national military forces almost coming to blows. You see, it's interesting because whenever we talk about the word conflict, and we use it personal, the actual etymology of the word conflict is rooted in warfare. It means to strike each other. And this idea of conflict, especially when you think about conflict as a war, as a battle that you have to win, I think in a little bit is a lot like a light at night and how it seems to attract moths. So I think this mindset that we typically have around conflict actually promotes this fight and flight response, this elevated stress level, this war mindset that can kind of get in the way. And last week, we talked about the power of words and the impact that words can have in our relationships. And we looked at this beautiful, sweeping passage that Paul writes for us to the church, originally written to a group of people in Ephesus trying to figure out how to make Christianity work in the course of their life. And this beautiful passage, we could have left there and think, oh, well, if we just do that, then there won't be an issue. But we would fail because human abilities are extraordinary when it comes to conflict. And if we're going to navigate people skills, then we have to deal with conflict. And in fact, we've said throughout this series that the quality of our relationships affects the quality of our lives, that like the quality of our relationships is so intimately tied with how we view the quality of our lives. And nowhere is this connection more true than the issue of conflict. Right? I mean, you could have the best day ever, but if you have a fight with your child or your spouse or your boss, it has an ability to distort everything else, doesn't it? I mean, conflict is just a pervasive force. It spreads in every area of our life, and we feel the weight of it. And so if we're going to be people who grow in our capacity for people skills, then I think we have to have this conversation around conflict. And I think the unique way that God positioned Christians to think and to navigate and deal with conflict. Because if we can master conflict, then I think the quality of our lives and our relationships can explode in a positive way. And so to help us in that journey, I want to take you to another letter that Paul, the most prolific writer of the New Testament, the most kind of influential Christian thinker outside of Jesus Christ himself, that he writes to a group of people who are trying to process, like the Ephesians did, like, okay, wow, I had this encounter with Christ. Like, my life has been changed. This Christianity thing is upending everything inside of me. Now, how do I do it? How do I live it out? And I think that's a tension many of us feel, right? We can sing songs like we sing that have songs about victory and joy and peace and love, and then we kind of have our world just fall to pieces and we forget every lyric to every song because we have the disconnect of the how. How do I do this? And at Encounter Church, we kind of obsess over the how. I think that the how of the Christian faith is really important, not just the wow of the Christian faith. Because we've all met people who seem to know a lot about the Christian faith, but did not make us want the Christian faith. I mean, some of the meanest people, if we're just being honest, you can ever meet are the self-righteous people. And sometimes it's those people who get in the way of people exploring Christianity. And it's because they live with a disconnect. And so fortunately for us, that's not at the heart of Christianity. Paul was really concerned about how people live out their faith. And so a similar group of people who weren't too far from Ephesus at the time was a church in Colossae. And in fact, Ephesians and Colossians, that's what we call those two letters today, they were in some ways circuit letters. That meant they traveled around the region. So it's possible the people in Ephesus read the letter to the church in Colossae and likewise the other way around. And naturally, there's actually some overlaps. If you were studying both of these letters, you'd kind of see that. And the reason why is because Paul writes them from prison to both of these groups. And he's thinking through this. And what Paul does is like he does in Ephesians, he lays out the wow and the foundational truths of Christianity, and then he transitions to how to live these things out. And in Colossians 3, we get to that point where he's making that broad, sweeping transition. He's going to use a phrase called therefore, and that therefore is because he's making that transition into the how in this chapter. And if you're interested in kind of unpacking more of that and kind of following along in the text today I'm going to have on the screen, you can download our app. We have that, because I would encourage you, if you leave today and you're like, man, this conflict thing was really helpful, there's another message I did back on April 12th of 2022 where I give even more practical tips around conflict. And that message and this message nicely dovetail together. And I'll make sure we kind of get that out in the email this week too. If you receive our email, we'll have a link to that. Because I think these two really paint this incredible picture of how God seemed to anticipate we would have conflict and help us to navigate how to deal with it. And so Paul writes this. He says, therefore, remember he's making the connection, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you have a grievance against someone. Now, Paul doesn't write this in English. He writes this in the language of his day, which is Greek. And sometimes you don't get kind of Paul's Paul's a really brilliant guy. He was trilingual, was one of the smartest people who lived in the first century, and it's obvious from his writings when you read it, the depth of connection and insight. But Paul's also kind of funny in word pictures that he uses, and one of them is this word grievance. It comes from this word to to have someone by the throat. It's like if you've ever wanted to choke someone, not that you would, of course, but like some people you know that would probably want to choke them. Like this is the image Paul's invoking here. Like that's, it's like if you've ever had that, then this verse is for you. So he's making the point that like this is pretty substantial advice I want to give you. And what I, again, love about Paul is the genius of Paul shows up in this passage. And because Paul is so intentional with his word choice, sometimes if you just blow through it, you can miss it. And this is one of those perfect examples of how Paul's building on what the Christian faith. See, Paul recognizes as a Christian that one of the core principles, kind of paradigms, realities of truth about the world is broken. And not just the world is broken, but people are broken. And broken people tend to break people. Hurting people tend to hurt people. And so Paul doesn't have some pie-in-the-sky version of Christianity. He's not saying, oh, Christianity makes the birds sing and the sky blue and it makes your bank account grow and your body's always healthy and everything is in check and life is perfect and great and grand and it's like living in a musical. No, it's not like that at all. He kind of makes this very explicit. He's like, look, you should expect conflict. You should expect that you're going to have people you interact with who you want to, right? Like it's an expectation. Because that's what happens when you live in a broken world. And the core of Christianity and the truth of Christianity is that the world was in conflict, not just with each other, but with God himself. And that God came to end that conflict by stepping into that conflict. And so we should, as Christians, expect conflict as a natural flow of life. Conflict in a relationship says nothing about whether or not that relationship is good or bad. It just shows you that you have a relationship. If you're breathing and someone else is breathing, at some point there will be conflict. And you should expect it. And he says this imagery, it's not just the choking imagery, there's another one he uses here. And this is a really important one. He says, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. In some way, Paul is saying, look, in our world, we associate conflict with warfare, but as Christians, I want you to think conflict and wardrobe. I want you to think wardrobe, not warfare. And the same way, the same level of intentionality, in fact, the word clothed is the verb. It's the action. Because it's a choice you make. Because all of us, right? I don't know about you, but if I'm just being really honest with you, I like a good fight. Right? Like, I like it because I like sparring with people and being like, oh, you said this. Well, guess what? I memorized something you did 15 years ago, and I've been waiting to pull that moment out, right? Like, I remember what you said. I have a really good memory. I like things stick really, really well. And so I like fighting. I read a lot, so I've got arguments that I need somebody to pick a fight so I can test it out. Right? And for those who are in the room who are like that, and you don't want to admit that they're like that, you can use me to channel you for a second, right? And what do you do when you have a really good fight, really good debate? Well, you're listening to them, and you're pulling out the weapons in your mind. You're like, shing, shing, shing. And you're like, you and what you said 3 years ago, and what I know about you, and how you forgot this, and your mom, right? Like, you're just plucking out things out of your head because you know, and you're just waiting them, you just wait, finish the sentence so I can, ooh, with that statement because it's so good. And we know how to do it. We know how to fight and have conflict and warfare. And it's all up here. We know how to do it up here. And Paul is saying, look, with that same level of intentionality, instead of stepping into conflict as a warfare, I want you to step into conflict and choose this wardrobe. And what he outlines is 5 things. That on the surface sounds very Hallmarkish. What on the surface sounds very like poster on like your office billboard or something you might read in a kid's book, but doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. Let's just be honest. These are like 5 virtues, and they don't really feel very conflictish, helpful. But this is where we can miss the genius of God coming through Paul. Because when you put this wardrobe on, it changes how you step into conflict. Right? He says, clothe yourselves, not arm yourselves, clothe yourselves with compassion. What's at the core of compassion? At the core of compassion is the question, do I care? Do I care about them? Do I genuinely actually care about what they're saying and where they are? Because one of the first things that you forget when you go into conflict as a warfare is it becomes a zero-sum game. There is a winner and there is a loser. And naturally, what gets jettisoned in the process is your care for them. Because what you care about is winning the argument, not about winning the person. And I have seen so many times in my own personal life and in the lives of others that I've walked with, I have seen people win arguments and lose people because they cared about the wrong thing. It's like, do I care about them? I think what specifically comes to mind as a parent of a toddler is this moment is constantly training me. I mean, literally, my kid, I have a 3-year-old who turns out there's a phrase, a three-nager, because it's like they're 3, but they're also a teenager, and it's totally, it's like so spot on. Like, we got through the 2s, and we're like high-fiving each other because we thought we were good parents because he wasn't crazy. And then he got 3, and he just lost his dang mind and became crazy. And we're like, what happened? And then I'm Googling, it's like, Jenny, there's a phrase called three-nagers. And she was like, yeah. I'm like, well, you knew this? Why didn't you tell me? You know? She's like, yeah, they kind of like get a little feisty when they're 3. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And it's like, it's irrational feisty. Can I just be honest with you? Like, they drive me insane because it's irrational. Like, there's just something about people who are irrational that bothers me. Like, my son will lose his mind over something. Like, insignificant in my worldview. And then, 20 seconds later, because I'll be like, okay, buddy, you don't want to eat that, like, PB&J, well, not PB&J, but like you don't want to eat this thing, you want to eat this thing, okay, you can eat this thing first. And then he gets really upset because he can't have this thing. I'm like, well, you were just crying 20 seconds ago because I was going to make you eat the banana, and now you're lamenting like the banana is the most sacred, precious thing in the world. Like, make up your mind, boy. And what my wife is so good at is, and I watch her, is she'll kind of lean down and she starts to talk to him. And where I want to bring out a hammer, you know what I mean? Like, I've like, that's my, like, I got a tool belt when it comes to relational conflict. And the one tool in there is this ginormous hammer. And I don't use it a lot, but every once in a while, I just like, you know, I just want to bring it out. I'm like, you will never eat again, right? I mean, it's just, like, it just escalate this thing to nuclear. And then my wife comes, and she's got, like, all these tools in her tool belt, even the, like, tools that, like, when you go to the bathroom and you see a bolt, and you're like, what kind of bolt is that they use to put that bathroom door together with? It's like a weird thing, and it's like a little pin in the middle, and it's like a star, and then you're like, who even has that tool? And my wife relation is like, shing, shing, I got that tool, right? I'm just like, oh, my goodness, because she leans down, and she couples the compassion because she cares with this ability to put on this next piece of kindness. Because she understands that sandwich is a really big deal in his world. In his world, sandwiches are a big deal. In my world, relational job pressures are a big deal. Finances are a big deal. Bananas are a big deal in his. And she gets that. And the reason she's so good at this is she compares this, she kind of couples this clothing combination, wardrobe coloration, like where she's got compassion that says, do I care, with kindness that shows them, do they know I care? Like kindness is about communicating your care. It's not enough just to actually care. You have to be able to engage with them in a way that they know you care too. And I see it with my son. In these moments, like Jenny just does this flip, and he knows she cares about the banana. He knows that she knows this is a big deal. Now, is it a big deal in your world, in my world? No. But like what you put on when you put on a wardrobe is you step into their world. And the compassion and the kindness. I'm just telling you, like these two things are powerful when you're dealing with conflict. Because most of us, when we think conflict, we think warfare, we don't think wardrobe. And when there's a conflict and they go loud, you go louder. When they go sassy, you go sassy. Like we retaliate. Right? We return. What they do, we parry it back to them too. But with the wardrobe of compassion and kindness, it's like you're listening to an argument play out, but there's no one yelling. There's no one going personal. You're taking it, in the words of a mentor of mine, you're taking the conflict seriously, but you're not taking it personally. Because you're listening to them, and you are able to say, I care, and I want you to know I care. And then Paul adds with humility, which is really important. Because at the core of humility is this ability to see the whole and to answer the question, can I own my wrong in this thing? Like if there is a kind of a problem pie, can I own my slice? Do I know how I contributed? Do I see where I messed up? Like, I don't know the exact percentage, but I'm convinced that a lot of time conflict has nothing to do with the other person and what happened that was the core issue with the other person. That oftentimes what is playing out in conflict is just circumstantial in my own life showing up in someone else's life. Like there was this old kind of like preacher back in the day who introduced me to this acrostic that I've added to in my life. That he was like, you know, if you want to know the areas, if you want to know what the danger zones are for you to not be a pleasant person, he's like, it's in this. It's like when you're hungry, when you're angry, when you're lonely, when you're tired, or when you're stressed. You may not be all of them. Like in my household, like hunger is a real thing. Like I don't get hangry. Like it's not a thing for me. Like I mean, obviously I have stores. Like I'm preparing for the food apocalypse, and I got like 30, 40 days that I've already stored up. Like I'm good. So I'm not freaking out when the food kind of shrivels up and we don't have snack around. But in my household, for those who like from the children of the 80s, you remember the movie The Gremlins? Like these cute little things, but like if you gave them chicken or water after midnight, which was so weird, they just transformed into these terrifying creatures. Like that's my kids. Like if you're driving down the road and it turns like 11:35 and they don't have food in their hands or their mouths, it's like midnight in the movie Gremlins. They transform. Like things they were playing with are now projectiles to be used against you because you're not providing snack for them. Like it's a real deal. I remember when I was dating my wife, and part of that was like getting to know the family, right? Because when you marry someone, you're not marrying a person, you're marrying a family. And so I took my mother-in-law, which at the point was not my mother-in-law, we went out to eat. Because I'm like, I want to know this woman. She wants to know who I am. And then, like, through the course of, like, the first meal, she leans over and she's like, I should tell you something that's going to be the secret of your relationship. Like, if you're ever going to have a great relationship with my daughter. And I'm like, man, who are you? You're incredible. You know, and like, naturally, you lean in. Like, you think it's going to be profound. And she was like, never let her get hungry. I'm like, am I marrying a gremlin? And then it's like, I did. I married a gremlin, and we have gremlin children. But, like, that's her. But in me, if I get tired, holy moly, the sky is falling, the day is horrible, all is lost. If I didn't get my 8 hours. I mean, if I don't get my 8 hours, I am like yelling at people. I am frustrated internally. I'm like, you know when you walk in and you're just angry and you want someone to fight with? Like, that's me. I'm like, man, who can I fight with? I want to fight with you. Right? You just feel it on the inside. That's what happens when I get tired. The rest of them, man, they don't have to sleep. They're fine. My wife can pull an all-nighter. She can get 4 or 6 hours of sleep, and she's functioning. Like, if I got like 3 nights in a row with 6 hours, I'm pretty sure I'm like 3 or 4 decisions away from being like the FBI's most wanted list. Okay? Because that's what happens on the inside of me. And a lot of times conflict, if we're being real, has nothing to do with them. It's that circumstantially what's going on with us is shaking us, and the junk is spilling out. The inner conflict, the inner turmoil, the inner, it's just kind of throwing up all over the relationship. And it really wasn't that big of a deal, but because of what was going on inside of us, we amplified it. And I think the humility sometimes just says, you know what, this conflict really isn't about them, it's about me, and I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'm sorry, I was insecure. I'm sorry, I was ridiculous. Like I mean, this happened to me yesterday. I was telling my wife about it. I haven't been sleeping very well recently. This is why I can be very honest and very accurate with my description. I don't know why. I just haven't been sleeping very well. And so yesterday I'm hanging out. We're at this event, and it's like my daughter and her friends, and I'm talking to this one of my daughter's friends' parents. And we're talking about like the whole prepubescent shift. And I worked in student ministry for like 10 plus years, and worked with middle school and high school families, and would do technology talks and help them navigate like just challenges they're working and walking through. And we were kind of joking about like both of our kids are on that threshold, and just I'm trying to like go back to what I used to tell other families because now I'm having to tell it to myself, and we're joking. And I mentioned this specific issue that I've been seeing and how I'd used to teach it. And this person looks at me, and they're like, kind of this look like, you just made that up. Like, that's not real. And, they're like a medical professional, and like all of a sudden, like I'm starting to feel a little insecure because I know they're like Ivy League trained, and like they're really smart, and they're like, are you sure it's not this? And I'm like, but I know that I know this, and I know that I've taught this, and I've researched this. And so I'm kind of like feeling this thing inside of me that's like, all right, you want to do this right here? Like, and I'm feeling it, and I'm trying to like politely double down on my argument. And then in my head, I'm like wanting to be like, do you know I have 2 graduate degrees? Okay, I've gone to school just as long as you have. Did you know in undergrad it was biology and chemistry? Like, I studied both of this. Like, I know biochemistry. I still read in biochemistry. I still read scientific journals. I keep up with quantum mechanics and quantum physics and new breakthroughs in laser dynamics. Like, all this is going in my head and be like, you should just let this person know. They can take their little Ivy League diploma and stick it back on their wall because I know what I'm talking about. And I go home, and this is the inner war while I'm having this conversation. And on the surface, you wouldn't see any of it because it's pleasant, right? And I go home, and I'm like, Jenny, I had the most idiotic moment inside of me today. It's like I was talking to this parent, and I just, everything in me wanted to credential myself. Who does that? I wanted to tell them about graduate degrees. That's so dumb. And it's just me realizing if I had not recognized how idiotic I was in that moment, it would have taken a very normal thing and blown it up into something else. And it was like, and I was telling Jen, it's like I almost embarrassed my daughter and her family today. Because someone gave me a look, and I'm pretty sure, because by the end of the conversation, they're like, oh, I need to know more about that. Like, they weren't. But I saw a look, and I was tired, and it turned into something. And I was having to fight back a tendency to, like, justify myself because insecurity was screaming in my head. And this with humility, recognize, you're like, oh, maybe there's something going on with me. Maybe it's not them. Or if it is, there's probably something I contributed. And then he says gentleness. And gentleness, my favorite word picture for this, go back to this image, right? As a parent, either whether you were parented or are parenting, there is this unique moment in that relationship where the child, either it's you or your children, has decided to make a very public display of your frustration, your anger, your rebellion. And like your parents are so embarrassed. And so you're doing this, and you're in this public space, and they lean over to you, and they're smiling, and they're like, I'm going to take every one of your toys, and I will never buy you any more toys again if you don't stop crying right now. Or like when my mom would be like, I will take everything you love from you, son, if you don't stop it right now. Like, no, that's not really what my mom would say. That's what I say to my kids. Actually, I'm just joking. Not really. But like, you know, it's like somebody walking by doesn't know because you're doing it with a smile. But you're like, I have my hand on the red nuclear button and I'm about to hit launch. I think that's a picture of gentleness in some ways, right? It's not that moment, but this idea that gentleness communicates the hardness and the heaviness of the conflict in a way that somebody walking by wouldn't even notice that there was a tense conflict. Like there's just the gentleness in the approach. Not the faux gentleness that we sometimes use or that was used on me, but a genuine gentleness that allows your words. Again, I see my wife does this. My kids get loud and then she'll start whispering. And it's this like Jedi mind trick. Right? It was the kids start to yell and she's like, hey, it seems like you're kind of frustrated. And they're like, what are you saying? You know, that leaning forward because she's getting quieter on me. And like she can do that on me. And it's like, I know she can do it, but I can't even, it's like my brain's like, she's doing this to you and you don't even know its effect. Because it's a Jedi mind trick. When you get quieter, when someone else is getting louder, it just breaks the thing down. It's an episode of gentleness. And then finally, patience is that last piece of the wardrobe that you put on. Because what Paul is brilliantly unpacking for us was something that NASA actually kind of discovered in the midst of preparing for the moon program. See, NASA has to deal with this really kind of fundamental challenge of taking people on a perfectly good ball of rock and getting them out of Earth's gravity field and then to a distant object and back safely. And you would think that like the biggest challenges, right, are engineering challenges, right? Back in the day with the space shuttle, like, how do you get it up? Like, what are the rockets and how you get it back in with the speed and the kind of the heat and all of the intricacies of that. But when NASA was doing all of the preparation for the space program, they were also running these tests and simulations because they realized the engineering challenge wasn't the only challenge. There was the human challenge. There was the conflict, because if you shove a bunch of people in a tiny piece of metal and they're zooming through the sky and outer space at 17,000 miles per hour, like, if things go sideways, nobody can just go to their room. No one can just take a walk. And so they did a ton of in-depth studying, especially even as they prepare for this idea of Mars. And one of the conflicts that they eventually started to really key in on was the conflict that arose between mission control and those who were in the vessels themselves. That while there was conflict between the people inside the vessel, the biggest conflict often was the one between the ones in mission control and the ones who were far away. So NASA started doing something. They called it looping for understanding, which is a really fancy term that essentially reflects what happens when you order at a fast food window. When you say, I want a 2-cheeseburger meal, they're like, you want a 2-cheeseburger meal, anything else? It's like they are looping back to you what they heard to make sure that they have clarity and that you both are in agreement. What looping for understanding, what NASA started to do was they started to slow down communication, even though part of the frustration of communicating with people on a vessel somewhere is the time it takes for things to communicate back and forth. The further you are away from planet Earth, the longer the time gap is. And because we're human beings and because of the subtleties of nonverbals, a little bit of a delay can do something on the inside to you. And so NASA counterintuitively slowed down communication to make sure they slowed down the conflict. And it was essentially what Paul is saying when he says patience. Conflict, like the story with Captain Pickett, conflict escalates quickly. This conflict has a speed and it's fast. And Paul says, no, in warfare, this is not warfare. This is a wardrobe. You go slower to go further relationally. You slow the conflict down. Whoa, it seems like I've upset you. What happened? Hey, what's going on? Right? Like it's this whole different aspect. And that Paul understood that if we were willing to put on that wardrobe, that it would start to change how we deal with conflict. It would affect how we deal with people, and it would radically improve our people skills. And to be honest, this whole conversation, like I said at the beginning, all these 5 virtues, intentionally choosing to put them on, they can feel a little awkward. Right? I mean, it's kind of like when I was in high school, the first time I really dressed up was prom. I don't know the first time you really dressed up. I told you I have a brain that remembers things, okay? So, like, the first time you ever dressed up and you felt fancy, right? It was like prom for me. Like, I mean, I had a suit on. It was tuxedo. There were things I'd never heard of that I had to figure out how to put on me, right? And it was like bow tie. And it's like I'm driving, and like the shoes are slick, and they're like shiny, and you're like, man, I am in like, just give me money. I'm gonna make it rain. Like I feel like something's going on, right? And I remember stopping at a gas station, and then you're like pumping gas and getting a Mountain Dew, and all along you look fly doing it. But you kind of look a little weird for people riding by. You're like, I want to get the Snickers bar and this Mountain Dew, and you got a tuxedo on. Well, that's a strange thing for a man in a tuxedo to order, Mountain Dew and Snickers. Right? And it's just, you feel weird. But I think what Paul understands, in fact, this is a picture I came across. I was like, this is how it felt for me. As like a 17-year-old, like dressed up at my gas station experience. But I think what Paul understood that was genius is you go back to the beginning of the passage. He says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. He's like, look, this is the wardrobe that I want you to put on, but I want you to remember, you don't wear what you're wearing because of where you are. You wear what you're wearing because of who you are and where you're headed. I had a tuxedo on that day because I was going to something fancy. I was dressed for where I was going, not for where I happened to stop. And he's like, look, who you are, if you're a Christ follower, is someone who has been chosen. As you can probably tell from my Mountain Dew and Snickers and my tuxedo, I was the kid that when recess was happening and kickball, like I don't know about you, but like kickball was a big deal when I was growing up. There was something about that hard rubber ball and ability to kick somebody in the face that just like, it just drew us every recess. And I hated that moment. I loved kickball, but I hated kickball teams. Because I was the kid who ran the slowest, and I was the biggest, which meant I was easiest to hit with the kickball. And so you would sit there, and I had a brother who was really good looking and athletic, and I mean, like, just, he would get picked, but I wouldn't get picked. And I think I kind of got attuned to this, like, the power of picking. And when you get consistently picked last for a long time, you start to appreciate the power and significance of being picked first. And Paul is saying, you were picked first. You're his chosen people. He wanted you. He picked you. Like, how crazy is the God of the universe who made everything from like aardvarks to like massive galaxies. He made it all. And then he's looking and he's like, I picked you. And I'm like, the chubby kid who gets hit with the ball? Me first? Yes, you, little kid. You're first. And he's like, holy. This idea that when God looks at you and me, if we're Jesus followers, he looks at you and me, and there's not guilt, there's not shame, there's not disappointment, there's not frustration, anger, or regret when he sees you. He uses the word holy, set apart. He looks at you and he sees Jesus in his perfection. You mean God's not sitting up there with a lightning bolt just waiting for me to mess up? No. I don't have to jump through these hoops and do all these things and light these candles and say these things to make him like me or be proud of me. No. What Jesus did was enough for you. And then Paul, to drive it home, he says, dearly loved. Wasn't enough just to say loved. He's like, no. As God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. When's the last time you felt dearly loved? Maybe it was today, maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was 10 years ago. Maybe it was 30 years ago, maybe it's never. There is something powerful and freeing about feeling dearly loved. Like, as a parent to that crazy little 3-year-old, if like tonight I was going to die and God was like, Chris, I'm going to give you one thing to give him that he knows, what would it be? I was like, God, I want him to know how much I love him. Because that's just such a hard thing to communicate. Like, I tell my kids all the time, and it annoys them. I'm like, do you know how much I love you? Because I recognize I have an inability for them to fully feel and know the depth of love that I have for them. I mean, this week, my little boy was sick, and he fell asleep in my arms, and I just sat there staring at him. He's like 3, and I'm like, he was the most beautiful thing in the world. I would have, like, if you would have been like, hey, you want to come to the Patriots game? Do you want to? I'd be like, no, I'm good right now. I am so good right now. Because I love this boy so much, and I want him so desperately to know how much I love him. And then there's those moments, I think, where if we let God break through, he was like, hey, Chris, that's me for you. That's how I feel about you. Dearly loved. And when who you are is that realized, you don't walk into situations needing to get something from someone. You don't show up in relationships being needy, because you show up already full. You show up already filled up. Because you're not trying to prove something to someone. You've already been picked. And you've already been stamped with approval. You're not showing up trying to get their affection, trying to get their love, because you walk in already dearly loved, already fully loved and appreciated and valued. And this is the superpower, because when you pair who you are with what you wear, then it has the power to transform any conflict that you find yourself in. And those two things are the ultimate people skill. Let's pray. God, thank you. God, thank you so much for what you've done. That for those who follow you, God, it is simply a response to what you've done. The love that we have, the approval that we have, the forgiveness, the grace that we have, they all flow out of what you've done for us. Father, I pray that what you've done for us would flow into our lives and how and what we do in moments of conflict. That you would help us to grow in understanding of who we are in you. And that you would help us to shift in our hearts and our minds about thinking about conflict as warfare and to turn it into your wardrobe. And Father, for those who are listening right now, who are coming to a realization that they're not a Christ follower. They're not a Christian. I pray that even now in their hearts that they would hear your words of love, your words of invitation, your words of grace, an invitation to turn to you because of what you've done. And so thank you that we can be confident, that we can be competent in the midst of conflict because of you, Christ. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So we want to close up today. We sing at the end of every service that we do at Encounter Church. And today I'm so excited for you because we want to teach you a new song that just punctuates what he's done. That for those who follow Jesus is at the very core of why you are who you are and what he said about you. That what he's done has the power to undo all that you've ever done before. That what he's done has the power to set you free and to allow you to walk into any circumstance, good, bad, and ugly, with a whole different set of love and reflection and that brand new wardrobe. And you look fly because of what he's done. And so I want to invite you to stand. And our team is going to lead us in this new song. And maybe for you, you just need to let this kind of float into your brain and process to you. For some of you, you may just need to begin to sing it as a declaration for who you are and where and how you're going to walk into that conversation and to that relationship at work or to that relationship with your kid or your spouse or your friend or your roommate. But allow this song to recalibrate you at the very depth and core of who you are. Listen.
On the hill of Calvary, my Savior bled for me. My Jesus set me free. And look at the wounds that gave me life, grace flowing from his side. No greater sacrifice. What he's done, what he's done. All the glory and the honor to the Son. My sins are forgiven. My future is heaven. I praise God for what he's done.
For the freedom
risen from the grave. What he's done, what he's done. All the glory and the honor to the Son. My sins are forgiven. My future is heaven. I praise God for what he's done. Now, on a throne of majesty, the Father's will complete. He reigns in victory. Oh, sing hallelujah to the King. He is worthy to receive all the worship we can bring. Oh, sing hallelujah to the King. He is worthy to receive. Come on, church, all the worship we can bring. What he's done, what he's done. All the glory and the honor to the Son. My sins are forgiven. My future is heaven. I praise God for what he's done. What he's done. What he's done. All the glory and the honor to the Son. My sins are forgiven. My future is heaven. I praise God for what he's done. I praise God for what he's done. I praise God for what he's done.
What he's done. See, Jesus didn't just make a way for us to be with him forever and ever and ever, but he also made a way for us to live full of love and compassion and kindness. And for those of us who follow him, we're to go out and spread that in relationships with everyone that we encounter, everyone that we come in contact with. What a powerful message that Chris gave today. I hope that we can go and live that out in our lives this week. If you're a first-time guest, stop by, see Chris on your way out. We have a gift for you. Tonight is student ministry, our second night back from 6 to 7:30. If you're in grades 6 through 12, we'd love to have you here. Meatball subs tonight is all I have to say, right? But we'd love to have you, and we hope that you have an awesome week. And may you walk through this week knowing that you are dearly loved. God bless and take care. We'll see you back next Sunday.